You may be seated. The court is now back in session. The floor is once again given to Noon Chi's defense to continue putting questions to this expert. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Short, I would like to read a few passages from the book from Steve Hedder to you, from Cambodian Communism and the Vietnamese Model. Maybe, with your leave, Mr. President, I will be able to put the relevant passages on the screen for Mr. Short to read along. We're speaking about document E3/22. ERN numbers English 00393644 until 00393675. Unfortunately, there does not seem to be a French or Khmer translation of this part of the book, so we have to limit ourselves to the English version. Maybe, with your leave, Mr. President, we could put the relevant passages of the book.
President, first, I believe you should ask the expert whether he has seen the document. Court officer, could you deliver the hard copy from the counsel for the expert witness examination first?
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe Mr. Short has answered that he isn't sure whether he has actually read it, so maybe if he has a look at it again, it will refresh his memory. You recognize it, Mr. Short? Could you repeat your answer?
I'm sorry. It is looking more familiar. I think I did read it after my own book was completed. Yes, I'm fairly sure.
Okay. I would like to read a few passages from both the foreword by Mr. Chandler to this book and some passages from the introduction of the book. So, because we don't have much time to go into detail, I would like to read to you the following passages. On page Roman 7, that is, to be more specific, ERN number 00393648. Chandler is saying, and I quote, "In the course of his analysis, Hedder disposes of 4 myths about Cambodian communism that have been accepted in whole or in part by many other writers. These are that the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK, and its predecessors were not communists at all, that they were controlled and led astray by a handful of Cambodian intellectuals who had studied in France, that they owed nothing to foreign models or advice, and finally, that in terms of theory and practice, the CPK was essentially Maoist." Just to give you more context, Mr. Short, allow me to read some more passages to put it all in one context. On page Roman 9, ERN 00393650, Chandler says in the second paragraph, "As Hedder convincingly demonstrates, French radical thinking was insignificant in the intellectual development of the leaders of the CPK." A little further on that same page, about Pol Pot. In the process, he became the protege of Vietnamese cadre and Cambodian communists like Tu Samut, who had been trained by the Vietnamese. On the next page, that would be Roman number 10. After 1975, CPK spokesman repeatedly claimed that the Cambodian revolution was without precedent and followed no foreign models. This stance reinforced the nationalist, quasi-utopian aspects of the organization, as the CPK called itself, and reflected its fondness both for concealment and for what it called independence mastery. However, as Hedder's study makes abundantly clear, at almost every turn in the first 45 years of its history, the CPK and its predecessor parties followed Vietnamese models, timetables, and advice. Now, moving on, because this is what Chandler is saying, in the introduction in itself by Hedder, that would be page 1 of that book, ERN 00393664. He says in the middle of that page, it lays the groundwork for understanding the behavior of Cambodian communists as the acting out of a set of political blueprints authored by the Vietnamese communists, who had once aspired to be the leaders of revolution in the region. A little further on that page, it describes how the Vietnamese taught Cambodian communists the general rules of revolution and the specific strategy and tactics for making revolution in the Indo-Chinese context. Otherwise we will lose too much time. Let me summarize the rest. What basically the main argument of Steve Hedder seems to be that DK policy, DK ideology, CPK ideology rather, was in essence completely modeled on the Vietnamese ideology, on the Vietnamese model. Now, having read with me those passages, do you agree with Steve Hedder?
No.
Please elaborate, Mr. Short.
To take the very first extract, Hedder is completely right in negating claims or refuting claims that the CPK were not communist. The CPK was communist. They were not led astray by a handful of intellectuals. They did owe a lot to foreign models, and it was not essentially Maoist. All that I agree with. The problem, it comes back to what I said earlier. Steve Hedder takes the view that the CPK should be seen essentially as a communist party among others. I take the view that the particular form taken by the CPK reflects Khmer culture, its Buddhist antecedents, and that is not found in any other communist party, not even the Burmese Communist Party. So we disagree over that, and we disagree over the extent to which the CPK took the Vietnamese party as its model. But this kind of disagreement is quite natural and normal among people who spend time studying these things.
I agree with you in general. But I feel I need to hear a little more arguments from you as an expert to dismiss the arguments, the well-researched arguments and facts from as what my learned friend on the other side have, somebody who's been called world's most leading academic on CPK policy and ideology.
It is absolutely true that the Vietnamese mentored the Cambodian party from its inception. Indeed, it was largely a Vietnamese creation at its inception. One can take out the word largely. It was entirely a Vietnamese creation at its inception, up till the late 50s, early 60s. We talked, I think, earlier about the 1960 Congress, which the CPK held without Vietnamese observers and without prior information to the Vietnamese. Then came, Heather mentions it, Pol Pot's visit to Hanoi in 1965-6, which was crucial because that was the moment at which Pol Pot really decided that the Vietnamese were bent on taking control of the CPK, and from then on the divergence became more pronounced. If you argue that CPK policy was essentially modeled on Vietnamese Workers' Party policy, you have to explain why, after 1975, one set of policies was carried out in Cambodia, in DK, and a very different set of policies in Vietnam, because they were very different.
True. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Short, but that might very well be caused by external factors. Threat, perceived or not, from about Vietnamese hegemony. The speedy character of the revolution. You know, in Vietnam, it took tens of years, decades. So in China, to achieve a victory. There might be cultural differences, obviously, between China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. But in essence, he is saying CPK was just a communist party, and in theory and ideology, it didn't differ from the Vietnamese or possibly even the Chinese. So am I to understand that you don't agree with that observation?
I do not agree with that interpretation.
Then once again, and I'm coming back to the first question before the last break. What was then the crucial difference in theory? Remember, I took you to 16 April 1975. What was the crucial difference in theory between Kampuchean ideology, CPK ideology on the one hand, and the Vietnamese ideology, or rather the Chinese, or maybe even the Soviet on the other hand? I'm still not getting the crucial difference in theory.
The matter of where theory stops and practice starts is a contentious one. One fundamental difference, whether you call it theoretical or practical, is that the Vietnamese party, which had been in power in the north since 1954, and therefore had a very long experience, was based on the working class, the industrial proletariat. There was no industrial proletariat, at least none recognized as such by the CPK. Therefore, it was based on the peasantry. Now, in theory and in practice, a party which is based on an alliance of peasants and intellectuals is fundamentally different from an orthodox Leninist party based on the working class, such as the Vietnamese Workers' Party. Workers' Party in its name.
Let me again try it from another angle. Steve Hedder is using the word blueprints. would you disagree with that particular use of that word, that the Vietnamese model was a blueprint for the CPK model?
I would disagree. A blueprint, yes, in the sense of the early stages of the revolution. When I say early stages, the pre-1973 stage, yes. In up to that point, there were quite close parallels. But once you get to the evacuation of the cities, I can only quote Mao's conversation with the Vietnamese leader Le Duan, where Mao said, "We couldn't do that, could you?" And Le Duan said, "No, we couldn't." It would have been inconceivable in Vietnam. It was what the CPK did, and it's a pretty major difference.
Is it fair to conclude and to summarize that had you been in a position to read Heather's book before publication of your book, it wouldn't have changed your view on CPK policy?
No, it wouldn't. And you know, to be fair, Stephen Heather and I had long conversations about these sorts of issues. I wasn't aware at the time that this book was coming out, or if I was, I've forgotten. But we talked about it. And if I might just add, I think a lot of this difference in interpretation is the fact that Stephen Heather concentrated on Cambodia and Vietnam. And my background, as I say, is of looking at many different cultures and systems, and what is specific to those particular systems, what the differences are, why the Chinese party and the Cambodian party are different. His strength was in the depth of his knowledge of this particular system, not so much in the comparative study.
Now allow me to ask you some more questions, and also following up Judge Laverne's questions 2 days ago about Mao thought Chinese communist ideology. In your book, you have been writing about contacts between Pol Pot and Mao, and Pol Pot and others, Zhou Enlai, I believe. Somewhere in your book, you're quoting the excessive praise from Pol Pot about the Cultural Revolution. You mention contacts with the former widow of Mao. I'm sure you can pronounce her name better than I can. Right in that period, second part 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of things going on about the Cultural Revolution. And earlier, of course, we had the Great Leap Forward. Would it be fair to say, or am I now oversimplifying things completely, that maybe the CPK policy was about combining the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution all at once and go forward, but still taking the inspiration from China when it comes to the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution?
Insofar as the Great Leap Forward is concerned, certainly this was an inspiration. It was a model. It was something that they wanted to do themselves, but to do better. As regards the Cultural Revolution, no. It was completely antithetical to everything that was done in democratic Kampuchea. I don't think any of the DK leaders, I don't know what was in their heads, but I've seen nothing to suggest that they wished to emulate the Cultural Revolution or that they understood what it was, which was something quite close to a civil war. they'd had that in Cambodia. They certainly didn't want to set one group warring against another for ideological rectitude. So the Cultural Revolution analogy is a complete red herring. But the Great Leap Forward, yes. And Zhou Enlai, when he met Q Sompon, according to the Chinese documents, said, you should not go down that road. We did it, and it was not something which produced enormous successes. It produced, as you know, 38 million dead in a huge famine.
About the Cultural Revolution, I do recall that you have been writing about contexts between, for instance, Yang Sari and people within that limited group, the Gang of Four. In your conversation with Yang Sari, was he able to speak about any possible influence on him or others from the Cultural Revolution?
I must be honest, I don't recall having discussed the Cultural Revolution with him. And I know the parallel is often made between what happened in DK and the Cultural Revolution, but with respect, it to me, with everything, all that I know, the little that I know about the two, they were totally unconnected.
But I'd still be interested in hearing from you the possible parallels and the differences between Chinese communist policy on the one hand and Cambodian communist policy and ideology on the other hand. What were, according to you, the striking parallels and what were the differences? I know you've said something about violence, but rather I'm talking about theory.
There were three major influences. The Great Leap Forward was one. The work of Lim Biao, who, it was a collective article, but it was ascribed to Lim Biao, about the necessity for the countryside to surround the city, both internationally, in other words, the third world is going to dominate the industrialized world and is going to surround it, and within Cambodia, because it is one of the basic principles of guerrilla warfare. You use the countryside to surround the cities and you conquer them, and that had been Chinese practice as well. That certainly was a major influence for Pol Pot. The idea that a revolution could be based on the peasantry also was reinforced by Chinese experience. But in China, nonetheless, there had been, all the way through, an insistence on the importance of the industrial proletariat. And Mao argued that actually the peasantry behaved like the petty bourgeoisie. That is, they would commit uncontrollable acts of violence. They were not disciplined, whereas industrial workers, the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, formed a reliable backbone for any party. Now, that backbone was absent in the CPK.
I'll move on because of time. When we look at what happened in practice, what happened in reality as a result of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, you would agree with me that, especially if you have read Frank D. Cotter's book about the Great Famine and recent literature on the Cultural Revolution, that the amount of casualties and victims of both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolutions are enormous. If it's not within the realm of your expertise, then please say so. But when you sort of zoom out, it seems unfair and unjust that former Chinese leaders are not on trial and DK leaders are being held responsible, criminally responsible for what happened. What is, in your opinion, the essential difference between the way Chinese leaders have been acting in those particular periods in the 50s and the 60s and DK leaders?
The President. Expert, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed.
I do have to object to that characterization. I don't think it's appropriate in the context of questioning for us as counsel to be commenting as to who should or shouldn't be on trial in what country. To the extent that my friend wishes to explore issues around ideology and effects on the CPK, obviously I have no problem with that, but I do object to this commentary as part of the questions. I think it's inappropriate.
I'm not inviting Mr. Short to say anything about criminal liability of former Chinese leaders, but I'm sure Mr. Short understands what is behind the question. Maybe we should give the expert a little leeway on this.
The President. The objection by the prosecutor to the last question posed by the defense counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia is appropriate. This question is irrelevant. The expert is therefore instructed not to respond to the last question. Counsel, you may move on.
That's a pity, Mr. President. I was keen on getting that answer. I think maybe the expert was keen on giving that answer as well. But I'll move on, Mr. President. I'll move on, Mr. Short, to more concrete events. More specifically, I would like to draw your attention to a page in your book, page 277. That is, Mr. President, ERN number English 00396-485, and French, in the book that will be page 357 till 358, and ERN number 006-39812 until 813. Mr. Short.
The President. Mr. Kope, could you please repeat the ERN number because it was not being followed by the interpreter?
I apologize, Mr. President. ERN English 00396485. French 006-39812, leading into 813. This passage, Mr. Short, is about the fighting in the Northwest Zone on or around April 18. In the middle of that page, you're writing that in the course of this fighting, and I quote literally, about 20 miles out of the city, these are Lon Nol soldiers, were ordered to get off and assemble in nearby fields where their arms were bound and they were killed. A little further on that same page, you write about similar massacres occurred throughout the Northwest. At Bailin, gem mining town on the Thai border, the Khmer Rouge arrived on April 20. people from neighboring villages, one resident remembered. And almost down at that page, you say, at the Samlaut crossroads, 15 miles to the east, they were all killed. So were 80 city officials. Now, before the break, I've been asking you questions about Odong 1974. We're 1 year later. In your answers to questions, you have given testimony that you are of the opinion that a policy to execute Lon-Nol soldiers and officials was in place, and that everywhere in the country these executions took place. So let me divide that up. What was your source for you to conclude that in 75 in the Northwest there was still this policy, the DK policy, of executing former Lon-Nol soldiers and officials in place? What is your basis for that?
I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint you because I have been looking at my notes, as you no doubt have done, and for that passage I can find no reference, which means that I omitted to put in the notes the reference from which it was taken. And I cannot at this distance tell you what that source was. I'm sure it was a written source. It was not an interview. But what the source was, I'm sorry, this is an inadequate answer, but it is the truth and it's all I can tell you. I don't remember where that particular statement came from.
Are you now referring to the actual events in the Northwest, or are you now referring in your answer to the existing yes or no policy of executing Lon-Nol officials and soldiers?
I'm responding to the events in the Northwest outside Battambang and Pailin at the Samlaut crossroads to which you just referred. I'm not able to tell you what the source of that information was because it should be in my notes, but it's not. It's a failing on my part. And I can't recall at this distance what the source was. It was, as I say, those descriptions of what happened in those places, I'm sure came from a written source, but what the written source was, I'm afraid I can't tell you.
Would you be able to say anything about actual orders or instructions coming from the center, so to speak, towards the north or northwest zone to do this?
With respect, I think we dealt with this in principle earlier. No, as I said then, I have seen no document instructing Khmer Rouge forces in the different zones to execute Lon-Nol soldiers and former high officials. However, it happened. It happened in a very similar way all over Cambodia. And I take that as a prima facie evidence that there was an understanding among all the forces involved that this was what had to be done. Was there a written document? Perhaps, but if so, I haven't seen it. Was it through verbal instructions given at Central Committee and work meetings or work conferences? Very possibly. I don't know. All I'm able to say is it happened in the same way everywhere, and that indicates a harmonization of policy throughout the country.
Assuming for a moment that you are right when you're saying that it happened everywhere, then how would you be able to opine or to give conclusions that what happened was in fact the result of an implemented policy, rather than, for example, understandable, between brackets, actions of revenge from local Khmer Rouge cadres on Lon Nol soldiers? I mean, we can agree, I think, that there was a bloody war in the last 5 years. You've written in your book that Lon Nol soldiers were not particularly friendly to Khmer Rouge cadres once they captured them. They executed them like that. How can we distinguish between what might very well be acts of revenge from local cadres, from local commanders, and not in fact the result of a nationwide policy?
I think we've agreed over the last few days that if there was one thing which characterized the Khmer Rouge movement, the CPK, it was extremely rigid discipline. It's very hard to believe in those circumstances that individual commanders, without a clear understanding that this was what they were expected to do, would have allowed their troops to carry out revenge as thoroughgoing and in as many places as we have seen. There were slight variations. There were places where Lon Nol soldiers were not killed, but were sent for re-education, where high officials were sent for re-education, but under extremely harsh conditions, which very few of them survived. These are the exceptions which prove the rule, but there were exceptions, particularly in the eastern zone. However, allowing for that, which in a sense makes the general picture more credible, because you do have these very small variations, the picture across the country was pretty much uniform. And in a regime that disciplined, an army that disciplined, there is a very strong presumption, at the least, that there was an understanding which resulted from a centralized order, instruction, policy.
Sorry to interrupt, we are in 1975 now. What is your evidence? What are your sources that the things that you've been describing happened in the Northwest were also happening in the East, or were also happening in and around Phnom Penh? Could you give one example of irrefutable evidence, really strong evidence, that there was this systematic pattern of rounding up Lon Nol soldiers and officials and execute them?
I think we discussed yesterday the exodus in, and I would have to look back to for the details, but if you remember, Hang Tung Hak, the former prime minister, and another official were sent back to Beijing, where they were executed at the Olympic Stadium, and the other officers were marched across the rice paddies and they're bludgeoned to death. This was something which was read out from the book. It is a description of an eyewitness who was part of that procession and who saw them being separated. There is a great deal of evidence of that kind. Now, you can say the eyewitnesses made them up, but when there is nothing, when everything appears to be consistent with that and there is no coherent evidence to oppose it, I think a court of law, like a historian, probably will accept it.
I understand what you're saying, and I hear what you're saying, but nevertheless, and excuse me for maybe being repetitive, but rather than just citing one account of one unknown person in your book, aren't you able to just really give concrete evidence, concrete indications that this really happened in 1975 as a matter of a pattern?
There are different sources of evidence from different areas. Now, if you were to give me a week to go through all my papers in storage in Paris, I could probably draw up a list of who testified to what, where. At the moment, in these circumstances, I can only cite cases like the one I have, but without in any sense trying to be disrespectful or to usurp your functions. If a court hears evidence from one witness, everything is consistent with the evidence of that witness and nothing contradicts it, it is, as a historian, in the same way as a historian, that evidence is taken to be believable. Well, that's the judgment I made on the various witnesses and written evidence which I saw, and I drew the conclusion that there was a pattern which presupposed a policy understanding.
And just to be absolutely clear on this, the fact that it, in your opinion, was a pattern is solely based on the fact that various witnesses are giving accounts of those things happening. Not a source telling you directly, yes, there was a standing order from the center to do this.
I accept, I agree with what you say. No, I have no evidence, and I think I've said this before, of an order from the Standing Committee, from Nguyen Chia, from Pol Pot. There is no evidence that I am aware of any formal written instruction. The pattern is, to me, evidence that there must have been at least a policy understanding conveyed by what means I don't know, but which explains why the policy was implemented in more or less the same way everywhere.
Now, Mr. Short, assuming for a moment that you are right and that there was in fact a policy to round up Lone Nol soldiers and officials and have them executed, how, although you haven't seen any evidence, would you think it would have been communicated? I will tell you the reason why I'm asking this. You have no knowledge, as I understand it, about executions at a place called Tuol Po Tre. That's a place somewhere in the northwest zone. But evidence might suggest that orders to do that, to have those people executed, could typically be conveyed through public sessions, political education sessions. Now, again, assuming that there was such a policy, and your knowledge of structure and communications, etc., how would such a standing order or instruction be typically communicated to zone commanders or division commanders or what have you?
There were two basic forms of communication. One was by coded telegram. before 1975, greater use was made of messengers, which continued after 1975, because telegrams, any kind of radio transmission was liable to interception, and secrecy being one of the watchwords of the regime, that was less rare. I'm not familiar with the case. That was not so common. I'm not familiar with the case you mentioned, but we actually looked at a document, and there are others, the other day, which said we should not discuss before the masses the elimination of counter-revolutionaries. And certainly practice from every account that has been published since is that people were not taken out and publicly executed. In most cases, they would simply disappear. They would go to what was called the forest in the west, which was a killing ground outside the village. And disappearance was a much more effective way of instilling fear and instilling obedience than a public execution.
Is it fair then to summarize your answer that it's not very likely that any communication to have Lon Nol soldiers or officials killed was conveyed to cadres through public or semi-public gatherings? Is that correct?
I would have thought that was correct. Before 1975, as we know, there were warnings, Khieu Samphan, Hu Yun broadcasting, saying, if you want to save yourselves, come over to the revolution now, come immediately, don't wait. But after April 1975, no, I would be surprised, it would be exceptional if that kind of order were conveyed in any public way.
Just allow me to step a little bit outside of this subject. And then I'll go back again. But would the same, in your opinion, be the case for orders or decisions to purge cadres? Is it, in your opinion, very unlikely that, for instance, Nguyen Chi or Pol Pot would say to a meeting of cadres X, Y, or Z in the East Zone should be smashed?
I would say extremely unlikely. We know of cases where messengers were sent from the Standing Committee General Office to the Eastern Zone, for example, to order purges of high-ranking officials. But these were messages, extremely secret messages. They were not done publicly.
So would it be fair to say that, in your opinion, low-level cadres or mid-level cadres, commanders, would not be hearing orders to execute somebody in a full political education meeting?
I would be surprised if such orders were given about named people. We know that Son Sen addressed meetings of military cadres where he talked about the necessity to smash, but without naming those to be smashed. And indeed, in many cases, that was a call for vigilance after certain elements had been arrested and when others were suspected. But they weren't, for the most part, those who were to be arrested were never named. That is my best interpretation.
Thank you. Now going back again to the fate of Lon Nol soldiers and officials. Now, of course, realizing fully that you do not know any specifics or details about what might have happened in Pursat province and Tulpo Tre, but there is evidence that might suggest that after the final battle of the fortress at Tulbo Tray, Lon Nol officials were more or less lured into a big meeting in a provincial house, having received speeches and being promised that they would get re-educated and even meet the king. And evidence might suggest that they left the provincial building happy and were really thinking that they were meeting the king. Now this is a story, it's almost about a plot to lure the provincial officials into their death. Have you heard or have you seen evidence that might suggest that such plotting, or however you want to call it, occurred in, for instance, in Phnom Penh or in other cities?
It is exactly what happened in Battambang, where the officers were told to put on their dress uniforms and they would be taken to be presented to the king, to Prince Sihanouk in Phnom Penh, and were killed early on the route, on the way.
Battambang is, as you know, in the northwest. You haven't been able to present concrete evidence of what happened in Battambang. We just heard from you. Do you know if such schemes happened outside of the Northwest Zone?
I do not, but this is not surprising because there was considerable leeway given to the zones, the zone commanders, in how they went about what they were supposed to go about. The objective was fixed, but the means were left at their disposal, which is why you have these differences between the different areas.
Now, of course, Mr. Short, you know, because you've written about him in various passages, you knew who was the commander of the Northwest. If you don't remember, I'll be happy to give the name to you. Your microphone.
Ronim.
Rosnim, yes. Do you remember what you have written about him? Do you remember speaking to other people about this particular character?
I'm afraid I would need to refresh my memory from my book or my notes. It's not in my head 10, 12 years later.
Would it be fair to say that he is if I might put it popular, an old school Isaac guy from the 40s who was there from the beginning in the 50s and the 60s with the Khmer Rouge or the CPK or whoever was called then at that time?
That was true, I think, of all the zone leaders, except for Chochet, who became the leader of the Western Zone when that was created. But all the others, Sopum, Kaipok, Ronim, Tamok, I'm leaving some out, but they were all former Isaraks.
You have been, in your book, in your book, you have been making a distinction between, on the one hand, intellectuals, and on the other hand, again, old school, hard-boiled, tough cadre from the Isaac movement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would you be able to elaborate on that distinction between those two groups?
One of the reasons why Pol Pot was chosen rather than Nguyen Chia as secretary of the CPK in 1963, after Tu Samut's arrest, was that he was thought to be capable of bringing these two groups together. It never completely happened, and it remained a source of friction right through the DK regime. I think we said the other day there are confessions in which arrested leaders speak of thatched houses, meaning the Isarak, and brick houses, meaning the returned students from Paris. That was always a source of friction. And I do remember Mr. Khieu Samphan saying to me once that the people who were really responsible for all the abominations were the old Isaraks who had become the warlords, the zone leaders in the provinces.
Now, would you be able to recollect whether Rosnim was such a warlord who did things by himself, not necessarily receiving instructions from whoever?
President, Mr. Expert, please wait. The prosecution, you may proceed.
I have to object to the content of the question because it misrepresents the previous response. The characterization of Isaraks as people responsible for all the crimes, acting of their own volition and without any instruction, if I understood the expert's response correctly, that was based on a statement by Khieu Samphan. It wasn't a conclusion that the expert has given. So I object to it being put to the expert as a fact or a conclusion or an inference that he has drawn.
Let me rephrase, Mr. President. Was there, in your opinion, a difference between the actions of the Isaac warlords on the one hand and ideas and policy maybe from the intellectuals such as Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan on the other side?
I would have made the point and reinforced the point that indeed the statement about the warlords being responsible for all the problems was Mr. Khieu Samphan's view. I would certainly not make it my own. The evidence is that the former Isarak leaders obeyed pretty scrupulously the policy laid down from the center. There were cases where they objected, not ever directly to Pol Pot or Nguyen Chia. I'm thinking of the case of Francois Bizot, who described when he was released by Duc on Pol Pot's instructions, how Tamok said, and Tamok was probably the most vocal of all the warlords, that the central leadership didn't know what it was doing. Bizot was an American spy. He should never be released. But he was released. Tamok went along with the instruction from the center. And it's a very small example, but no one among the Isaraks, among the former Isaraks who were zone commanders, was going to disobey what the center had laid down.
Now, you know, I presume, Mr. Short, what happened to Rosnim in 78?
My memory is not very precise, but I think I would stand little chance of being wrong in saying he was executed.
Do you know why he was executed?
You're taking me to a level of detail which is not in the front of my mind.
Have you heard any evidence that might suggest that he was executed because he wasn't listening, for instance, to orders or instructions coming from the center?
If you wish me to offer anything resembling an intelligent response, you will have to allow me to refer to my book, because I have not learned it by heart, and it's a little while ago.
Maybe, if you allow me, I could get back to the question tomorrow and give you some time tonight to have a look at it again. But I suppose my question on this topic is that we've been speaking about examples right now of executions in the Northwest Zone in 1975. Would it be possible that those executions were ordered by Rosnim and that he didn't get any permission for this to do so from Nuon Chea or Pol Pot or anybody else from the Standing Committee?
Mr. Expert, please wait. The prosecution, you may proceed.
I have to object because the expert has said that he doesn't have the evidence at his fingertips. He hasn't been able to give much evidence about Tol Portray, and we looked at Battambang earlier, that wasn't available immediately. I think asking him about whether it's possible that Ross Lim did one thing or another is simply inviting him at this stage to speculate.
The questions of my learned friend were one big invitation to speculate, I might add, but I will rephrase, Mr. President. Talking in general about communication structures, about the roles of local commanders versus the center, warlords, Iraq warlords or not. Now, would it be possible that on the battlefield and shortly after battles, zone commanders decided for themselves to have Lone Nol officials executed, Lone Nol soldiers executed?
I understand the intent of the question. I understand where you're coming from. It would not have been possible for zone commanders to act against or outside the broad policy consensus which had been laid down by the center. You are not dealing with an army which descends into banditry, which on a large scale, which takes matters into its own head and carries out massacres. You're dealing with an army which was quite small, not an enormous force, which was very rigidly controlled. Yes, there were individual cases of looting. There were bound to be. But large-scale, systematic killings of particular groups, no. I find it inconceivable that would have happened outside a broad policy consensus which had already been laid down.
Now, that is where I lose you, Mr. Expert, Mr. Short, sorry. Americans killed many innocent people in My Lai in 1968. There wasn't a standing order to do that. We have established that communication in that period, of time was very difficult. I recall a passage in your book where it sometimes takes a month for one message to arrive. How can you be so certain in saying that individual actions, individual decisions by zone commanders were impossible?
When we talked about messages sometimes taking a month, that was in 1971, at the period when the Kampong Thom headquarters had just been established. Later on, a proper messenger network with relay posts and everything else was set up. It became much better, and they also developed a wireless capability. You mentioned My Lai. I think it is generally accepted that that was one relatively small, I'm sorry to put it that way, but relatively small in terms of the things we're talking about, action by an aberrant American squad. We are not talking about hundreds of officers being rounded up and shot or bludgeoned to death. Of course, there were individuals killed, groups killed, without anybody's instructions. There were small-scale, in inverted commas, local atrocities. But what we're talking about here is a pattern of killing of a whole group. It's, with respect, not comparable.
Mr. President, I would like to move on, although I have a few minutes, I would like to move on to another topic, and maybe it's late in the day. I'll use consider my extra half hour being used up.
President, thank you, Council, and thank you, Mr. Expert. The time is now appropriate for today's adjournment. And we will resume tomorrow morning. And for tomorrow, that is Wednesday, the 9th May 2013, we will commence at 9 a.m. and we will continue to hear the testimony of the expert, Mr. Philip Short, who will be questioned by the two defense teams. And Mr. Short, the hearing of your testimony is not yet concluded, and you are required to testify again tomorrow. For that reason, you are invited once again to appear before us to testify before 9 a.m. Court officer, in collaboration with WISU, could you assist the experts to return to his place of residence and have him return to the courtroom tomorrow at 9 a.m. I notice the counsel is on her feet. You may proceed.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I don't want to delay the hearing. I simply want to have the permission from the chamber to give to Mr. Short a list listing the different listed pages in English so that he may be able to read them again tomorrow in order for us to avoid wasting time tomorrow. And I also would like to provide 2 to 3 documents that were placed on the interface so that he may also become familiar with these documents so that things are more fluid tomorrow while I question him.
President, yes, you may do so. Court officer, could you deliver the hard copy documents for the expert so that he can review it tonight? Security guards were instructed to take the two accused, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, back to the detention facility and have them return to the courtroom tomorrow prior to 9 a.m. As for Nuon Chea, bring him to the detention, to the holding cell downstairs, which is equipped with the equipment for him to follow the proceeding. The court is now adjourned.